Welcome back to the new section, Angular 9 New Features in Action. In this section, we're going to delve into Angular 9 and implement some of the new features to show how they work. We're going to look at the friendly error messages, the 3 modes of template type checking, and how to set up localization with the Angular localized package for internationalization, or the I18N, and we'll also look at the language service improvements for your IDE. So let's start with the first video of this section, Friendlier error messages. So first we're going to start off by looking at the Friendlier debugger that Angular 9 provides to help you debug better and faster. So with this improvement, you can now access the Angular global namespace functions at runtime, which means you can access instances of your app components, any of the call methods, and even update the state in the DOM. And then you can also trigger change detection and so on. So pretty cool. And now you can also detect and display errors during compile time instead of while the app is running. That's really helpful. And we'll also see some better stack trace messages to kind of quickly help you narrow down your search for the culprit that causes the error. So let's go and take a look. All right, so here in the IDE. Now remember that in the previous video, we already upgraded Angular 8 to Angular 9, so I'm not going to use that project. We're comparing Angular 9 with the Angular 7. And these are kind of like the same 6, 7, 8, using the same view engine. So the error messages should be very similar. So I'm going to go and open Angular 7 and open that in a terminal in that order, 9 as well. All right, so let's go to Angular 7. And the first thing we want to look at is just how errors are detected early on versus something that is much later in the code. So in Angular 7, if you open the source folder, open the app folder if you haven't already, and then open the app component HTML, the template. And at the very top, you should see this variable called title, right? It's a variable or a property that is associated with the component. If you open the app component TS file, you should see this right here. It came by default anyway. So let's do this by changing something in the template. Okay, this is in the source code. So if you change anything here, usually the compiler will detect it. On the template, however, older version usually doesn't detect that. So that means if I go here and change the title variable to, say, title 2, right, something that doesn't exist, we know for sure doesn't exist. And let's go ahead and run that in the command terminal and see what happens. I'll just use the default port 4200 for Angular 7. And as you run, you'll see that, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, it would not detect that change. And fire up the browser to load that as well. Okay, so it was compiled successfully. If I go to the browser and refresh my host here, you see that everything looks fine, right? We don't see the title here. It assumes that it's there, but really it's not. So it gives you this false information. We call this false positive. Something is there, but it's not really there. And if you press the F12 key or inspect it with the right click and then inspect, you see that there's no error as well. Nothing here. You can refresh it. You can do a right click on empty the cache and reload. Nothing there, right? So this is pretty interesting. Now let's go back to the IDE. And this time I'm going to do the same thing for Angular 9. We'll keep this open here. I'm going to go Angular 9, do the same thing in the app folder. Inside the app component, make sure that it is title is there, right? It's the only one we have. And then in the app component HTML, we're going to change this line at line 42, right around there. The title will be also changed to, say, title 2. We know again that it doesn't exist in the component here, right? So I'm going to switch over the terminal to the second terminal, and we'll run with the port 9000. And we'll see what happens. All right, so there you go. You see something very different from the previous one, right? You see that it has an error that's detected way before we even run in the browser. Because of this error, that means you can't even run it yet. I can go back to the browser and load that 9000 port, and you see that you cannot get it. It's not there if you press the F12 key, and you get the error message saying something that's not working right? And so let's go back. And you can look at this message here. If you compare to the previous one, you compare it a little bit later, it's actually much nicer. It tells you that this title 2 doesn't exist. and it's right here, this line 42 in the template here, and then it's being called from this component and this area here as well. So it has an early detection, and the reason why this one does this way is because, again, Angular 9 uses the AOT compilation process. That means it compiles everything, including the template, right, before it bundles up and then sends it off to the browser. Now, Angular 7 and 8 in the previous versions uses the JIT, which means it won't detect that until it's on the browser. But once it's in the browser, then it's already done because you don't have any changes, right? So to fix that, let's just say, for example, if we go to Angular 9 and change the configuration, like right in the Angular JSON file, if I change, say, if you scroll down to right around line 21 here, the AOT is set to true for the project here, right under the build. If I change that to, say, false, now I'm using the JIT method, which means it should be the same as the previous version, which means it should not detect this error. Let me turn this off, clear my console, and run it one more time. Now I'm using the JIT instead of the AOT for the build. So you can see that it does not detect any error. It will run just like the old version, right? No problem there. If you go to the browser and refresh your browser now, and everything works just fine. Again, the title is not there, missing, but no errors. So that's one of the things that you can kind of see in Angular 9. And the same thing for anything you change in the view or the template will not be detected at all. So that's something interesting. Now, if you make a change in the code, though, it should detect that. So let's go check it out and see how that works. So back in here, I'm going to go ahead and turn these off for both of them. Control C to cancel. And I'm going to go here and turn this back to true for Angular 9. Okay, and I can close this file. So let's go and undo that title 2 here. Let's change it back. Press Control Z to undo it, and then just save that. You can close it so it's not too confusing. Same thing here. Just undo it and then save and close. Okay, so now back in the component, in the TypeScript, if you make some changes in here, of course, it should have some error. Say, for example, Angular 9, I'm going to go and add another variable here. We call it maybe points, and was assigned to a type number, and was set the value of, say, I don't know, 30, 20, right? You'll make that as a string of 20, okay? And you know right off the bat that this is an error because it tells you right there. This tooltip tells you that. So we save that, and now you do the same in Angular 7. So here's Angular 7. I'm going to add the same variable, points, of type number, assign the string 20. So again, both should fail. So I'm going to go to compiler down, the terminal down here and then run them. So Angular 7, let me clear my console, just up arrow and ngserve. It should detect that because it's in the source code. Okay, so we got the error here, right? So here's a single line saying 20 is a string, it's not assignable to a number type. Okay, so if you go to Angular 9 and we do the same thing, we run that in port 9000, it should also detect that as well. So anything you do in the code can be detected, whether you have an assignable variable or you change any of the components that doesn't exist in the code, it will detect that because you're doing the build, right? So here we go. You can kind of see the difference here versus Angular 7 or older. Just a single line tell you not much about it, I guess. Just say, the assigned 20 is a string, is not assigned a number. And it kind of give you here said, okay, if this file at this line number 10. So line number 10 will be at that point, okay? And it's good enough. It's all right. And if you compare that to Angular 9, you see that's much, much better. It gives you the information here in a separate line. This is the same as the previous one, but you went ahead and also point out the actual code, what it looks like in your code, okay? So that's one example there. Another one is something a little bit better. If you, let's just say if I undo this, and well, let's change it to the actual numbers now, and do the same thing just in case I forget both of them, okay? And we're gonna cancel the compilation down here. We don't want to compile it for both of them. So clear the console, and same thing here as well. And just a little bit nicer, if you go to the modules instead, so open both modules, 9 and 7. and say that, for example, the app components doesn't exist. Accidentally put an S here for something, right? Put S here and see what happens. So Angular 7 and Angular 9, I'll do exactly the same. I put an S for the app components. It doesn't exist. And do the ng-serve again. You should get the same or similar error as before because again, it's part of the code, the source code, and not a template. So same thing as before, right? You can see that it's much nicer than before. It tells you exactly where it is and so on. If you add more error messages, if you apply more of these, like put 2S up here and elsewhere, you run it again, it's going to give you more information. It's like a stack trace and so on. So it can give 2 of them in here and so on. So it's much nicer than the previous one where it just give you a single line if you go to in 7 and do that. If I put both of them both places and save that and run it, the errors are not as nice, I would say. So it's going to help you, build your app much faster. So you can see, it's not very, very clear. Compare this to something like this, we can visually see it. So it's much, much nicer that way.